Welcome to our Purple Team Dialogues podcast.
With Steve Townsley and Richard Gold, a cybersecurity podcast focused on both offensive and defensive security.
Welcome to another edition of Purple Team Dialogues with me, Stephen Townsley, and Richard Gold. And today we're talking about Phineas Fisher then.
Phineas
Let's
Fisher.
go.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So this is the hacking team breach from 2015, I believe.
That's right. And this is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because this is hacking team who were a offensive security company building tooling used by governments and intelligence agencies. So you would think would be really good at security. And we've got this group here, Phineas Fisher, who not only get in and leak a bunch of data from them, but provide a really detailed outline of how they did it.
Yeah,
which is it's great. Yeah, it's a really good read. And I think so often with breaches that we hear about, you might hear about it in the news, but all you know is somebody got hacked. You might know maybe like a little bit of detail, right? And I've seen some public sector breaches where they've given a lot more information in various reports and inquiries, which is great. But yeah, it's not often we get such a good view of what happened.
Well, all those other breaches, all those other reports and stuff are written by the defenders. This is written by the attacker. And that's what I think makes it so worthwhile.
That's a great point, isn't it? Because I guess even in a lot of breaches, the defenders don't have the full picture.
Not at all.
Got an idea, right?
Yeah, sure.
Pieces together, but probably don't know everything. And I think with that, we're relying on this source being truthful. I don't see any reason why they would lie or exaggerate in this in their narrative.
The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we saw the data being leaked. There's a torrent file that was put out there. It contained everything. It contained zero-day exploits for Flash, which were then used by threat actors almost immediately after the breach. So it was the real deal. So whatever exaggeration is inside this, it's pretty minimal, I would imagine, because they did actually do the things that they claimed to do.
They certainly seem very credible, don't they?
Yeah. And the way it's written as well is such a hacker way of writing things, and the little digs and stuff that they make. And clearly this person was very motivated, clearly despised hacking team for their targeting of activists and others and journalists, and were really on a mission to tear them down. Same with Gamma Group, which they did previously.
And we'll put a link to the report that's been written in the show notes so other people can read it. But I really recommend just reading it end to end. It is a good read, isn't it?
It's a cracking read.
Very enjoyable. Yeah. But should we try and break it down and pull out some of the key red and blue points to it?
Yeah, let's do that. I think there's a lot to learn for everybody in this report. So should we start off at the beginning with what they describe as how they set up their infrastructure? I thought that was really interesting because they talk about the importance of OPSEC, operational security, for them. As a black hat hacker, they say that this is their day job as well as a sort of hobbyist activist on the side. They are concerned about possible law enforcement operations. So they are very OPSEC savvy, OPSEC aware, and they're playing it very, very safe. So their infrastructure is really mixed. They're using a bit of Tor, a bit of VPNs, they're hacking some servers using them. These days, you'd also expect people to throw things like residential broadband proxies into the mix, potentially cloud services as well. But they do comment on how a lot of the nation state crews that end up being reported on don't care about OPSEC in any way. They'll have a server, they'll run it for years until it is really blocked by everybody. But as long as it works, they just continue, right?
If it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And yeah, you've got to respect that. It's interesting from the blue team side, because we often, IOCs have been around for a long time, and we talk about the value and maybe the not so value of those. Certainly, as you were saying, for those APT folks who just aren't rotating their C2, then great. We can grab IOCs, take feeds, maybe detect, prevent on those. But if you're up against someone sophisticated who is rotating their infrastructure, who's doing really smart things to have good OPSEC, your IOC is just not going to cut it on the domain or the IP or whatever you're looking at.
Yeah, and they say
Because
it's quite explicitly that this is brand new infrastructure for each operation that they perform.
it's high end stuff, isn't it? These
Yeah.
folks know what they're doing.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah. They really understand how security services work, how they are typically deployed, and what their failure modes are.
And how they got their initial access is pretty
Oh,
sophisticated as well.
this is wild. So it turns out, and I think I'll just read this little bit from the report because it is just so amazing. So they say they had three options: looking for a 0-day in Joomla, a 0-day in Postfix, or a 0-day in one of the embedded devices. Turned out it was a Dell Sonic Wall was the perimeter device being used here. And they say, looking at these, a 0-day in the embedded device seemed like the easiest option. And after 2 weeks of work, they had a remote root exploit, which is crazy. I mean, it depends, of course, on the embedded device we're talking about, how it's configured. We touched on this in a previous episode. Is it like a MIPS device that has absolutely no exploit mitigations? Is it some horrible PHP web app running as root, whatever? But it seemed crazy. I mean, we were talking on this beforehand, how of those three things, the perimeter device was actually the easiest one.
I wish I had the technical skills to be able to do that and just go, yeah, spinning up a 0-day is my easiest option. I'll just spend 10 days and knock it out really quick.
But they did mention that they usually use phishing, but decided against that for Hacking Team because Hacking Team obviously use phishing for their attacks. So they considered that to be not likely to work, which was an interesting side point.
And that makes sense, doesn't it? And I wonder if there's an OPSEC element to that, which is this, and maybe from the red team, you could speak to this more of when you start phishing, do you start showing your hand? Are you concerned about that if you start pushing, payloads out over phishing emails that you might tip off the blue team?
It's always an issue. From the outside, however, you're basically assuming a personality. So you're adopting domains, IPs, delivery technologies. And if they get fingerprinted or burned, you can throw them away like yesterday's newspaper and move on to something else. Of course, it takes time. Sometimes there's a cost involved, right? And like a commercial cost involved, as well as time, effort, and that kind of thing as well. So obviously you don't want to get caught, but the consequences of being caught that early don't matter too much because you can rotate your infrastructure and move on to the next thing. However, if there was a very particular, let's say, pretext you were going to be using for your attack, and you felt that that was really going to be successful, for example, you've identified the one third-party supplier that's really trusted by your target, and then you get burned and then you can't really impersonate them anymore, then you really are making yourself difficult. So it's kind of case by case, but yeah, it's absolutely a concern.
It's one on the blue team side. I've often been asked by stakeholders is, can you tell us who's attacking us and what kind of attacks do we see? And often at that phishing stage, you just don't know. Okay,
Huh.
maybe we see some credential phishing, maybe we see some payloads, maybe, but the initial early stage, right? They don't really mean anything. It's almost impossible at that stage, unless somehow you can link it to an attacker, or a known group, maybe via an IOC. You can say, oh, this is North Korea, or this Russia, it's China, whoever. But yeah, by and large, from my experience, we just never know. We just see a bunch of phishing get either detected or blocked or reported.
Yeah.
And behind that could be the world's most sophisticated group, or could be some script kiddies. You just
Yeah.
nowhere
You don't
knowing.
know. No, not at this stage, I don't think. Once they got in and they were able to, they were root then on the Sonic wall. They brought in a bunch of tooling, some quality of life stuff. A couple of interesting bits there was Python responder for interfacing with Active Directory and collecting credentials being sprayed around the network, which I thought was quite interesting. And also using a SOX proxy so that they can use external tools as if they were on the inside. And they used that a lot during the coming attack. So that I felt that was quite an interesting aspect to it. They also talk about how they ran responder first in analysis only mode, so it wouldn't spray out a bunch of stuff by itself. So they were just listening silently to that kind of passive collection, which is quite impressive. And then when they were using Nmap through proxy chains, they were doing it with a very, very slow timing on that. So it wouldn't be so obvious, you weren't trying to hit every single machine multiple times in seconds. It was really, really, and they talk about, hours, days, weeks that they spent on this op. So they really took their time. I thought that was also interesting because from the blue side, how would you pick that up? Can you even pick that up?
I think you'd see maybe after the fact, you could rewind and look at logs and figure out, oh, okay, yeah, now I see. But without knowing, what you're looking for, that kind of traffic, it'd be very difficult to identify that. I think maybe if you're looking at a perimeter device like that, you shouldn't see that kind of activity. But we've talked about this before, the challenges with things like firewalls, VPNs, any kind of perimeter device, maybe not web servers, just being able to put EDR on them or any kind of defensive tooling, any kind of hardening, it's not usually an option. You're just very dependent on that vendor making it secure by design, or having things like, hey, application allow listing would be quite nice. Tools of that nature, you really are dependent. And I think on the blue team, the only way you can, from what I can see, work around it is doing that hardening yourself, which is sometimes really tough because you might not have the access, the knowledge. Might be an element of breaking warranties. I don't quite know how these devices work, but if you start playing with them and removing tooling, does that invalidate other things? Particularly if it's something on your edge like a firewall or a VPN. I don't think your network team are going to be too happy if you just jump on and say, "Hey, let's start removing some of the
binaries for you." I mean,
yeah, don't worry about it.
I don't think you'd ever be able to continue having a support contract for a device like that with a vendor if you'd started monkeying around with the operating system.
It'd be tough, right? And with Responder on the red team side, so you're grabbing hashes that are flying around the network. Do you then replay those hashes, or do you try and break them offline?
Both. It depends on what it is. Some of them are really nice to be able to reuse, like the very old kind of NTLM stuff. Other stuff requires more the password cracking methodology. But yeah, it really depends on what you find. Sometimes Responder will even find plain text stuff that's being sent around the network. It's harder to find these days, right? But if you're in a legacy environment where there's a lot of FTP or HTTP, you may find actual plain text credentials happening. But Responder, I would say, is more well suited for those legacy environments. A modern environment, you're going to have less success, generally speaking, with it, I would say. Another interesting thing I felt with this one is they talked about how they tested their initial access on other companies. So they found like a bunch of other sonic walls on the internet and popped those to make sure that everything was working fine before they went into hacking team. So if you see hacking activity, it may not even be targeted at you. They may just be using you as a test bed.
Wow, I'd feel so relieved, but yeah, quite used. It's really sophisticated, isn't it? Like these folks knew what they were doing.
A lot of experience.
Yeah, they know what they were doing. And for the blue teamers, spinning up something like Responder and running it feels like a really low cost, easy way just to get a sense of what's happening in our environment. And from my experience of working at various firms, passwords are just a nightmare to get to a good state. Maybe most privileged accounts you could do a lot of work on, but there's always that legacy, those service accounts, even some privileged ones that have never changed their password. We're too scared to change it. We don't really know what it is, or if we know what it is, it's very weak. And then you can just take that offline and crack it.
Yeah, and there's some stuff is also vendors will introduce a bit of kit into the environment, and they will say, this needs to have domain admin privileges.
So common. Yeah, so common. And our own internal users, I've created an app. It needs to work. Let's give it domain admin because then it will definitely work. Triggers me as a security person. But I get it. I get where users are coming from. But yeah, interesting they were able to bring so much in and get it spun up and get it going. They had a great thing going on, right? Just all from this sonic wall device.
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful position to be in the network. They were able to cross-compile a lot of, standard offensive security tooling and to work on it. And you had a great little platform. Probably it isn't going to get rebooted as well. I mean, they also they had a remote root exploit, so they could just have re-exploited the box anyway. But yeah, really good position to be in.
Remind me, sonic wall, is it a firewall or a VPN? Something of that nature?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have a WAF in front of it or anything like that might try and filter out. And I guess a lot of these exploits will be I don't know how WAP would even find it. Um, yeah, to prevent it.
Yeah, typically it's a perimeter device,
Yeah.
so you're not really going to have much in front of it.
No,
And
of
also, I mean,
course.
hacking team was also not massive, so they didn't have a huge amount of people where that kind of security architecture, defense in depth. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, I think they were doing their own security administration rather than having a dedicated function to do that. So
Interesting.
yeah,
And this is where the story stops. They get in. There's great defense in depth. There's nothing available, and they just give up, right?
yeah,
And we're
that's
done.
right. So I think we'll just call it there. And
It's
well,
been a
no.
great show.
Luckily for the attacker, they were when the MAP scans were pretty fruitful. So they came back with a bunch of internal Mongos, and rewinding back to 2015, these were Mongos without authentication by default. So you would have had to have done some extra work to configure it. Mongo is not the only one which does this kind of stuff. There's other sort of software from that time that does that. And they say things like, our security model is that you run this on a secure network. So we don't actually provide you with any security tooling. Thanks, guys.
Solid thinking.
Yes, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
So that was actually, although that was an interesting one, they found a bunch of the recordings and screenshots from the hacking team testing stuff was stored in the Mongos. They had a lot of fun looking at the hacking team people through this. That was actually not the really juicy bit. The really juicy bit was the iSCSI backup devices. So they mention here in their write-up, the insecure backups were the vulnerability that opened the door. So that strikes me, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Steve. Backups, how are they protected as much as they should be?
I think everybody's getting better at it now, but because of ransomware, because ransomware
Right.
groups had this great habit of
Yeah.
just deleting them, or encrypting them as well, which is really smart. I think
Yeah.
backups are really tough, and I've talked about these before, where it's a really good thing to say we should all have great backups. But some of the ransomware attacks and other attacks that I've read about recently, people talk about, yeah, we had backups, but they weren't tested, or the systems were so well configured or customized that the restore was really challenging. And I think it's a real discipline to do backups well. But
Well,
interesting here, yeah, that they weren't well secured, so the attacker could swan in there and
yeah, grab them all.
yeah,
I mean, but this is funny that it's such an issue to this day. There's an old, Unix sysadmin, big beard thing from decades ago, which is, backups are easy, restoring is hard.
nice.
And it seems that we haven't progressed. I mean, this is a joke from like, what, 30, 40 years ago.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, I don't think we've moved on, and
No,
I get it to some degree that everyone's stretched, everyone's busy. We've done the
yeah.
backup. That's we right. We've got it. We won't need it though. Unlikely we'll need it. So let's park it. And if we need it, we'll figure it out. I worked in a regulated role where there was a lot of emphasis on testing backups. So it meant
Oh,
that the infrastructure
cool.
team spent a lot of time not really doing infrastructure, but testing if backups worked. So yeah, we can restore the VM. What about the application? Well, let's not worry about that today. Yeah, that's another team. That's another problem. It's a whole artwork, and I would love to, yeah, maybe bring on a guest sometime, maybe from an IR firm, to talk about their experience during a breach, trying to help somebody restore. It's not just one click. There you
Yeah.
go. The network's back, everybody. We've spun everything back up. It's a challenge.
And I think
Yeah,
we saw this as well with some of the recent stuff on ransomware, that even if you do pay the ransom and you get the decrypt key back, it is a very long journey to get your organization running again.
100%. Yeah, and there's a lot of smart talk about things like resilience, and we need to have plans and rehearsals and all sensible stuff, but they're against a backdrop of IT teams that are in the trenches, just trying to keep the lights on.
Yeah, firefighting, right?
Exactly. And doing all that sensible stuff can be tough, but certainly unsecured backups, as shown here, are great for attackers.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it is a really nice thing, and I've having found unsecured backups lying around on internal networks, I've had a good time
Ooh.
with them. In this case, they had the Exchange server was inside the was one of the things that was backed up. It was an image, and they were able to mount it over the network to a VPS that they had, which is really nice little trick. And they even post the commands in the write up, so it's definitely worth having a look at that. Really, really cool. And inside of that, there was a BlackBerry Enterprise BES, if you remember that from a long time ago.
That's old school BlackBerry. Yeah, now we're
BlackBerry, yeah, you
talking.
remember those? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that account, and we've talked just as we were talking about vendors having privileged accounts, that enterprise account, the BES admin account, was local admin on many machines in the internal network, Windows machines. So then they used this to get into a Windows machine on the internal network. Classic situation. They ran Mimikatz, and they were off to the races. And they dumped either the passwords for, including, I guess that's how they got the domain admin password, right? That's it. Then they were in control of the Windows environment.
And that's a terrifying place to be, isn't it? Having a domain admin password compromised. Hopefully in the write up they give that Mimikatz dump, don't they? And you can go
Yeah.
see all the clear text passwords. Some of them are okay, some of them less so.
What of the
Probably the
lol
weakest one
great
is the
sysadmin?
yeah. Probably the worst one is that domain admin password of uppercase P for SSWORD.
Yeah. Isn't
Oh
this
dear.
the perfect example of the cobbler's children have no shoes?
Nice. Yeah, you're gonna have to explain that one if someone's listening and doesn't get
Yeah,
the.
yeah. So basically, that if you are the craftsman, you typically neglect that yourself. So, and I'm sure a hacking team as an offensive security team is not alone in having poor systems administration practices. I mean, as I say, it looks like they were doubling up as well on the roles they had. Some of their guys were working on the platform on RCS as well as being sysadmins for the network, which is never going to work out. So,
And on the blue team side, from my experience, the only way you can't do this through policy and education. It has to be technical controls that stop folks doing this.
oh yeah,
And privileged accounts are always targeted by attackers, well, by and large, from my experience. And there's lots of low cost things we can do. So identifying them, make sure they've got passwords that have changed, ensuring that we use least privilege, so not everybody has high levels of access and privilege. But in this case, something like a PAM tool, so something that's rotating these passwords on a
yeah.
regular basis, would have made this harder for the attacker. I'm sure looking at their sophistication, they would have found a way through that. But ideally, it doesn't have the age of the password, but I'm curious how old that credential is.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter because that's the live credential from memory. So once you're on the box, you can dump the creds out of memory. It doesn't really matter if you're rotating the passwords because that's the live credential.
And is this where the admin's remoted onto the machine and the password's been cached?
Typically, yes.
And there are
Typically, yes.
ways to prevent that in Windows with
Yeah,
various
it's gotten
options.
better. It's definitely gotten a lot better. So
There
again,
maybe wasn't back in
this is
2015.
2015,
Yeah.
so things were different. And also, probably hacking team were not applying best practice anyway. But yeah, generally speaking, you can do work to disable the caching of passwords in memory. What we like to do is flip that back on again once we get onto a machine, and then happy days.
That's just for the blue team side, really annoying.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, we
because to deploy something like Credential Guard, or there's another one, I can't recall what it's called, to stop the caching of credentials, so the authentication is done on the source, not the destination.
Yeah.
That would be a big bit of work. That would need a lot of testing. It would need a lot of change control. There'd be a lot of nervous people about doing that because you could really impact how folks work in your organization. So to do all of that and then just have it reversed by an attacker, it services that really interesting one about configuration drift. And that's something, if you take something like that, if you're deploying something like Credential Guard, ideally, you then also need to be looking for the configuration drift. Where is that then being turned off? Turning it on at a point in time, adding it to your gold build or whatever it may be is great. But yeah, that's quite scary that it could just be flicked off and you'd be none the wiser, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays with CredGuard and the having this kind of like virtualized part of memory where stuff lives, I think that approach is harder than it used to be. I haven't done it recently, so it is harder than it used to be in my experience, and I haven't tried it that recently, but I also haven't needed to, because what's happened is, as I'm sure you're aware as well, we've the IT estates have moved away from having everything, being in LSAS and that kind of stuff, to being in people's browsers or tokens stored on the file system and these kind of things. So as that has changed and IT practices have changed and developer practices have changed, attacker tradecraft has changed as well. So it used to be the case, if you rewind, 5, 7 years more, it was all about Mimikatz, dumping LSAS, different ways of dumping LSAS, handle reuse, all that kind of stuff. And that would be, the whole op would be about, okay, how are we going to get into LSAS? How are we going to get those credentials? And now it looks very, very different, because developer practices and administration practices have changed. And also, fair enough, they've done work to make it harder. And EDR, of course, is very sensitive about things touching LSAS. Although you do have these situations where people will tell you that, oh yeah, we get a lot of FPs about access to LSAS because we've installed some piece of software for managing, matchboxes in the stationery cupboard, and it requires domain admin and is constantly touching LSAS. And the EDR just doesn't know what to do. So we had to disable the alert for that. So there is some nuance around that, of course, but generally speaking, it's just not the hotspot that it used to be.
Fascinating. And I guess all else fails, just hop on SharePoint and find a domain admin cred in a script or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which I've seen a few times. Yeah. So you don't forget LSAS and tooling, just browsing, right? And
also it depends on what your goals are as an attacker. Again, it used to be the case that it was just domain admin, that's the goal. We get domain admin, job's good, and we're all happy. Nowadays, it's usually much more about getting access to particular pieces of information, or whether it's credit card details, health details, intellectual property, these kind of things, which represent the value to the company, because the company is not domain admin. What? But these kind of operational things are really, really important for them. And then often it's normal users who have access to those things. You don't need to have that Active Directory privilege.
I guess on the blue team side, you can increase the likelihood of finding that by monitoring, if it's domain admin abuse, sort of to your point, it can be quite loud. Certainly I've seen some great detections on anomalous use of privileged accounts.
Yeah.
Where you still got a very busy environment, lots of people with domain admin, but boom, as soon as it's used somewhere strange, that's loud. That's gonna trigger a SOC.
I wouldn't even bother going
response.
After domain admin. I haven't done that for ages. Wouldn't even bother. Just don't.
As a blue teamer, that pains me.
Yeah, but I mean, you're successful, right? It was an issue before. That avenue is generally closed off, but then other avenues are also there. So.
And that speaks to a theme. I know we've mentioned it before. That just continuous evolution.
Yeah.
You shut down one path, boom. That we're dealing with a very, not always sophisticated, but certainly an evolving threat where we will never win. There will never be complete victory.
But there isn't in nature.
True.
You don't say that lions have won over wildebeest. It's just, it doesn't really make sense, right? It is.
It's a good comparison. Certainly, again on the blue side, I have seen it with senior stakeholders. That is something that's tricky to communicate. So we've just spent 2 million on security tools.
Are we done?
Great. Yeah, right. So we've completed security. Well, actually, bad news. We've changed as a business, and then also the attackers are evolving. So now we need to buy the next widget or do the next thing.
Well, and then looking at a report like this, they really are doing the stuff that they've done. People have done so many times before, and so it was just moving on to sort of the last piece here, which is the attacker then figured out that there's an internal network which contains the source code for RCS, which is the hacking system that hacking team developed, which they sold to governments and so on. And that's what the attacker is interested in. That is the goal. But how do they get into the this secured environment? Well, they found a TrueCrypt volume, which was not mounted all the time, which would contain some passwords. So they waited for it to get mounted and then pulled the passwords out. Great. They found a Nagios install, and that I think is the key part here. The Nagios install was a machine that bridged the corporate LAN and the secured internal development network. And then being able to use an authenticated exploit against the Nagios gave them that access to be able to jump into the secured domain. And it's, we touched on this earlier, right? That they were partially air gapped, which I guess is a very, very common thing that people think the networks are separated, but real network separation is unbelievably hard to achieve.
It's a great term, that partial air gap. And I see it in lots of different controls. EDR, we have EDR. Well, yes, but not on these machines for all these complex reasons. We have other security tooling, but actually there's these edge cases where we don't have it. And I think that's true across so many different areas, isn't it? Where we say we've got it, big caveat, we have it partially.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that when you're drawing a network diagram, for example, you'll draw the secure internal development environment as one bubble, and then you'll draw the corporate LAN as a separate bubble, and then you'll go, well, these are separate bubbles, and so we're done here. But the devil's in the details, and it goes back to that fantastic presentation by Rob Joyce when he was at NSA TAO, talking about how what you think you've deployed in your network. The NSA knows what you've actually deployed, or in this case, Phineas Fisher knows what you've actually deployed. And they were able to deduce that there was this connectivity between the two networks, and it wasn't that kind of strong separation that you had to go into a separate building or whatever to be able to use. And the funny thing is, I think with this, is that they did it for probably the best reasons, which was logging and monitoring, so that they could keep an eye on the health of their environment, support their developers, and so on. But as it turned out, that was also turned out to be a big weakness.
It reminds me the importance of, on our side of the house, spending more time, not necessarily red teaming, but thinking like an attacker. I think it's really easy on the blue side to head down. Usually you're part of IT, and there is an IT view of the world of how we're set up. But we're worried about attackers, and they don't care about any of that.
No.
And spending that time to do that internal reconnaissance, or bring in red teams, purple teams, etc., to get that perspective, really valuable. Because if you don't, probably the first time you'll get it is when you're doing the IR for the breach, and it turns out your air gap is a partial air gap.
Yeah.
And you have a theory, right, of why there wasn't more security tooling in the network.
Right. And I think that part of it is because they were developing offensive security tools themselves. They were developing exploits, they were developing C2 implants, and they were legitimately concerned about their tooling being caught by security systems, security appliances, security devices, software, whatever. And so they would most likely, and this is a hypothesis, but they would most likely have disabled a bunch of these, or just chosen not to deploy a bunch of these in order to have that freedom to do the development work, which is also why I wonder how Mimikatz was able to run in their Windows estate without any trouble.
Not the most subtle tool, even back in 2015.
Right.
I think it was a known thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the final part I'd like to touch on is how they spent so much time, the attacker, monitoring the employees, doing keystroke logging and taking screenshots to understand the day-to-day workflows of the employees. And we've seen that as well with one of the other reports that Phineas Fisher has done on the breach of the Cayman Bank and the SWIFT and the network, how they did SWIFT transfers. And Fin7 also in the indictment against them also talks about this. And as an attacker, I do this too, right? Monitoring employees for how they do their jobs is so fantastic. It's again to your point earlier about monitoring things like internal wikis and SharePoints for that kind of data, which is definitely more useful to me than an Nmap scan or anything like that. And I think that's something also, to your point about spending time thinking as an attacker, getting to know what's actually available inside your environment in this way is really pays dividends, in my view.
And it doesn't feel intuitive necessarily if we talk about critical assets and things we need to protect to think about IT documentation. Or not even IT, right? Even just critical system documentation.
Yeah. Network diagrams. Oh,
yeah.
Amazing.
Have it available to everybody. Why wouldn't you? Well, in cases like this,
yep,
becomes really key for the attacker. And I see there was still a bit of password reuse in the mix in their environment, which
can't get away from it.
I use a tool, or I have used a tool before to find it, and it pains me every time I run it.
It is hard because technology is rubbish, and it makes it hard for us to have strong individual randomized passwords for each account. And we touched on this with the Twitter account one from before, right? That you have to share an account for business reasons because you have a team who are using one account. Okay, so how do you do that? And the technology being rubbish doesn't give you a way to do that. People want to do their jobs, so what do? They share a password.
So common.
Yeah,
so common. But what a great story and a great perspective on a breach and the different TTPs that that hackers use, right?
Brilliant. There's so much in here. There's so much detail. Definitely worth reading very carefully. And I think it's still relevant, even though almost 10 years on. The tradecraft, the approach. I think there's a lot to learn for both blue teams and red teams alike.
Definitely. There'll be breaches happening today, probably very similar